Hello, you beautiful people. Today we're covering some NBA fantasy sleepers that will win you your drafts, or at least I think so anyway. So, if you're new to fantasy, a sleeper is considered a player who I think will way overshoot the value of where they're being drafted at. So, to determine this, I'm using ESPN's average draft position, or ADP, as a metric of where these guys usually get drafted. So, a sleeper in the context of this video will be a guy that I think will do way better than their ADP/their projections. I'll go into a bit of detail about how much better I think they'll do as well. So I split them up into groups, so we have guys who I think are sleepers at the earlier stages of drafts, in the middle stages, and then at the end. So now that that's out of the way and all sorted, let's go ahead and get right into it with the early sleepers. And real quick before we get started, I forgot to mention, I have a Discord, the link is in the description. It's a really great community in there if you have any fantasy basketball questions, if you want to talk about sleepers, get advice for your drafts or anything. There's like 1,000-something people in it now, so a lot of people to answer your questions if I can't get to it if you leave a comment. But also, if there's any sleepers that you think I've left out or that you think will be a great sleeper option, then leave it in the comments and help other people out. I mean, I'm not going to take it as a hate or anything if you're giving other sleepers. I mean, we all just want everyone to have the best drafts they can, so feel free to help each other out. Leave a helpful comment if you think there's someone I missed. But anyway, getting started at the beginning of my drafts, my first sleeper I'm going to talk about is Chris Paul. And this one just seems a little bit insane to me because his average draft position is like 56.7, which means he's getting drafted like at the 56th spot. And I really could not tell you why. I mean, last season he finished 17th in total points. And based on my projections, if you haven't seen, I made a top 100 rankings video. I sort of try to base that on my projections for how many total points I think they'll score in the year. So it's kind of a combination of the average and how many games I think they'll play. And Chris Paul finished 17th last year. I have him projected to finish around 20th this year, which means I would draft him around the 20th pick. So if you can get him at any space between 20 and 56, I think that's an absolute steal, especially if you can get Chris Paul in like the 30s or the 40s. If you're getting him at 56, I don't even know how that's the average draft position, but in my opinion, he is like the epitome of a sleeper this year. Like, that is just crazy value to get him at that spot. I think it's maybe due to like people are concerned about like the aging effects or that maybe he's going to miss a ton of games this year randomly. But I mean, he played in a decent amount of games last year. He played in 65, which is usually like the metric of how many games I want my players to play in at the very minimum if I'm drafting like one of my top guys. And yeah, I mean, he averaged around 40-something fantasy, 45 fantasy points per game last year. I'm really not seeing that take a drastic nosedive to like into the 30s, which is what it would have to be for him to finish at around 56, and he'd have to like not play in a ton of games. So yeah, I'm really not too sure why Chris Paul's being slept on this year, but if you can get him at any pick between 20, I mean, 20 it wouldn't be a sleeper pick because that's where I think he should go, but if you can get him from like 30 to 56, I think that's an absolute steal for Chris Paul. So moving on, second sleeper on my list, De'Aaron Fox. I'm back, second year in a row. I'm on the De'Aaron Fox hype train. Average draft position is around 47th right now. On my projections or on my rankings, I have him at 24th, which is where I would probably draft him at. So again, if we're looking at that difference, that's like 23 spots in value between where I value De'Aaron Fox and where his average draft position is. So that's a pretty significant difference. Like, if you can get De'Aaron Fox in the 30s, even in the like, I don't know what drafts he's falling to in the 40s, but I guess clearly he is. I know this is a combination of points and categories that determines these average draft positions, but I mean, there's not really an all-in-one metric for points leagues average draft positions that you can use, so this is the best I got. But yeah, De'Aaron Fox, I think he's easily top 30 player. If we look at his numbers from last season after Halliburton left, he was averaging around 28 points and 7 assists per game, and I'm expecting more of that to continue this year. I think his scoring numbers were way down. He wasn't comfortable sharing the backcourt. He really needs the ball in his hands to be effective. And now that he's going to be running the offense for the Kings, I think we should see pretty similar numbers to what he was putting up after the Halliburton trade happened. Plus, him and Sabonis in the pick and roll, he's had some really solid efficiency numbers with that combination. So I'm very high on De'Aaron Fox. I think he's going to way overshoot his average draft position of 56, or of 47, excuse me. So definitely think that's a huge sleeper pick that you can get for some great value if you can get him in the 30s or even the 40s if he somehow falls to you there. And then moving on, this is someone that I was high on even before the recent news of the LaMelo Ball injury. And while LaMelo isn't going to be missing that much time, I still think Terry Rozier is an absolute sleeper of a pick. His average draft position is around 58th right now. On my projections, I had him 36th before the LaMelo Ball injury, and I still have to update where I would put him now. I don't think I would drastically move him from 36, though. Like, last year he finished 24th last year for total fantasy points. And again, that was like with Miles Bridges being on the team as well, so his usage was being a little bit more hindered than it should be. But now that he's the like confirmed number 2 option on the Hornets, I really think we're going to see a huge fantasy season out of Terry Rozier. I would not be surprised to see him averaging 40 fantasy points per game. And if he's averaging that, there's no way he should be going at 58. On my projections, he's 36, like I mentioned, and that's exactly where I would take him. So yeah, there's about 22 spots of value for him there, in my opinion. So if you can get him in the 40s, I think that's an absolute steal of a pick in your drafts. Next up is Keldon Johnson, who I think is going to be an absolute steal in a lot of people's fantasy drafts this year, especially when you look at his average draft position. It's around 89th right now. I have him projected to finish around 53rd, and it's mainly just if we're looking at his numbers, DeJounte Murray was the guy on the Spurs last year. It's no secret. Everyone knows that. If we look at the last 13, 14 games of the season here, Keldon Johnson was absolutely electric. He averaged over 40 fantasy points per game, and that's honestly not exactly what I'm going to expect him to average this year, but I would not be surprised if he ends up averaging high 30s, and I think that's enough to place him very close to the top 50 in value for fantasy leagues. So yeah, if you can get him, there's almost a 40 pick discrepancy over my rankings and his average draft position. Personally, I'm very high on Keldon. I think Pirtle or him is going to lead the Spurs in fantasy points this year. It's just kind of a matter of who between them. But yeah, Keldon Johnson, he's a very solid scorer. Maybe we can see a little bit of a rise in his playmaking this year. You're getting most of his value from his scoring, though, so it remains to be seen how the Spurs are going to look this year. They are not a good team by any stretch of the imagination, but I am very high on Keldon Johnson, and I think he could be an absolute sleeper pick for you in your fantasy drafts. And then lastly, my last sort of section for the early part of your draft is going to be Michael Porter Jr. This is the first player that's been injured and missed a lot of last season on my rankings, or in my sleeper video, but I think he is someone that we could see have a lot of really solid return value this season. If we're looking at his average draft position, he's getting taken around 87th. Personally, I would take him in the 50s. I have him ranked 55th. So again, there's 30 spots of value in there. If you can get him in the 60s or the 70s, I think you're getting an absolute steal of a pick. I mean, if he falls to you at 87 for some, that's his average draft position. So it seems like, at least on average, that's where he's falling to. If you can get him there, I think this is a pick that could really help you win your fantasy drafts. If we're just looking at his game, I mean, he's such a solid 3-level scorer. He can really do it all, from the scoring perspective. He grabs a decent amount of rebounds because he is 6'9", 6'10". And I'm expecting him to average around 20 points per game next year playing off of Jokic. He is an elite off-ball mover, an elite shooter, like I've already mentioned, 3-level scoring threat. So yeah, I'm expecting a really big season out of Michael Porter Jr. I think he's a lot of potential as a sleeper pick, and that's going to do it for the early part of the draft. So now we'll go ahead and get into the middle section of draft sleepers. Alright, so these are kind of guys that I have ranked in between 50 and 100 on my rankings, and whose average draft positions are a lot lower than I think they've been, as is the theme of this video. So first up, Wendell Carter Jr. of the Orlando Magic. The main reason I'm expecting a big jump from him is his playmaking. I think he's been a very underrated passing big man, and I think next season could be the year that we see a lot more assists from him, because the only real point guard on the Magic is Markelle Fultz, and he's set to miss some time, and even if he doesn't, I do consider Wendell Carter one of the better passers on their team. So I'm expecting an uptick in assists, as well as maintaining his similar numbers from last year, which he averaged around 15 and 10. So yeah, put that together, there's no way he's going to be at his average draft position, which is 107th. I have him projected at 70. I've changed my rankings a little bit and moved him a little bit higher. So yeah, I have him at 70. His average draft position, 107. There's 37 spots of value there for you. So yeah, if you draft him in the 80s or the 90s or the 100s even, I think you're going to get a great value added to your team. He's definitely going to go a long way to helping you win your fantasy league this year. So definitely watch out for Wendell Carter. Moving on, next up, I have another Orlando Magic player, and that's Franz Wagner. His average draft position is around 94th. On my projections, I have him at 71st. And very similar reasons to Wendell Carter. I think Franz is a very solid playmaker, and he's not getting a lot of credit for that on these projections. If we're looking at how many fantasy points per game ESPN has him projected to average next season, they're only expecting around 31. I would not be surprised if he averaged 35 fantasy points per game next year. He's a very solid scorer. He's a very solid playmaker as well. Decent rebounder, not as great as you'd like, but I mean, it's mainly the playmaking and the scoring. So yeah, definitely watch out for Franz Wagner next year. I think the Orlando Magic are going to be a really solid team, which is why I have these two guys so high, or a really solid team for fantasy perspective anyway. I don't want to comment too much on how their team's going to perform, but well, it's whatever. Basically, the moral of the story, Franz Wagner, Wendell Carter Jr., I think are absolute sleepers this year. Both of their projections, or their average draft position, is way too low right now, so if you can capitalize on that, I think you're definitely helping yourself in the long run for your drafts. But moving on, we might have the most criminally underrated player on average draft positions right now, and that is Jaren Jackson Jr. He's getting drafted around 133rd on average, and that's just ridiculous to me. I have him around the 70s on my rankings. I know he's set to miss the first month of the season, and there are some injury concerns, but when you get to the later stages of the drafts, when you're in the hundreds, I think it's worth taking a flyer for the upside that Jaren Jackson Jr. does have, because if he comes back and he plays like he can and puts up his fantasy numbers from last year, you are looking at a guy that could finish very easily in top 50 for averages per game, and then it's just a matter of how many games he plays to determine his total points value. But I think getting him getting drafted at 133rd is a bit ridiculous, because this is a league winning pick if you can get him in the 70s or if you can get him in the 80s or the 90s. it's just crazy. Like, I just don't understand why he's going so late in drafts. I know there's the injury concerns, but like I've mentioned, at this stage in the draft, I think it is well worth taking a flyer on Jaren Jackson Jr. because he should definitely be getting drafted earlier than 133rd. But anyways, moving on, next player on my list, this is a guy that I am a lot higher on this season than I think some people might be, and that's Trey Jones. I do think he's going to be the third best fantasy option on the Spurs. That might be a bit controversial, but I am kind of doubled down on it at this point. His average draft position is 110th. I have him at around 86th. If we're looking at his average per game, they're expecting him to average around 31 fantasy points. I wouldn't be surprised to see that get up to around 35. If we're looking at the end of last season when DeJounte Murray was out of the picture and he was sort of the main point guard running the offense, he was averaging around 14 and like 7.5 assists. Could I see that maintain itself into this year? Maybe. I'm not too confident on the 14, but I mean, if he can give you 12 and 7, I think that's great value to be drafting at around the 86th spot. I mean, if he falls to at 110, I think that is an absolute steal, so he makes his way onto the sleepers list for that reason. But moving on to the next player, Monte Morris, another point guard who I'm a huge fan of now that he's on the Wizards. They've been struggling for a point guard ever since Westbrook left. I think Monte Morris is going to do a great job next year filling that gap. He's just such a smart player, one of the best assist-to-turnover ratios in the league, which I always talk about every time I bring him up. Very smart passer, low turnover rate, running the offense for the... he's not running the offense, but you know what I mean. He has the ball in his hands, organizing plays for the Wizards. I think he's going to have at least 12 and 7 for his numbers. If he can give you that upside, I think that's a great pick to get him at around 87th, which is where I have him projected. His ADP is around 120, so there's 40 spots of value where you can grab him. So if you can get him in the 90s, the 100s, the low 100s, the 110 range, I think Monte Morris could help you with some solid fantasy value. And then lastly, for my middle draft sleepers is Jordan Clarkson. ADP is around 126. I have him ranked 91st on my list. If we're just looking on the Utah Jazz, man, the Utah Jazz suck ass. Their team is so bad, and I think it's just going to afford Jordan Clarkson a lot of opportunities and a very high usage rate. They're projecting him to average around 25 fantasy points per game next year on ESPN. I just don't see any way in which that's true. He's going to be absolutely chucking up shots. He's better at making them than a lot of people are. That's why he gets to take tough shots, but still, his efficiency is a bit of a concern. But I think we're going to see a little bit of an increase in his assists per game now that he's going to have to be more of a playmaker. I am expecting him to take the most shots of anyone on the Utah Jazz. He just loves shooting it. He's got the ultimate green light on the Jazz team that's trying to tank games anyway. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't just let Jordan Clarkson do his thing. So definitely think with that upside that I think he overshoots his ADP of 126. If you can get him in the low hundreds to 110 range, I think that's an absolute sleeper of a pick. Like I mentioned, I personally would draft him around the 91st spot. So yeah, that's going to do it for the middle of the draft sleepers. And now last up is the end of draft / late draft sleepers. If you're in a very deep league, maybe you'll be grabbing these guys before the end of the draft, but they're just sort of low rostered guys that I think are going to way overshoot their fantasy projections for this year. So we'll just go ahead and get right into that list right now. All right, so once you get to an average draft position of 140 on ESPN, it just kind of levels out, and it's pretty much guys that are not rostered in most leagues, so they don't even really have an average draft position. But at the top of my list is Tari Eason. I've sort of ranked these guys in order of who I think will be the best for fantasy purposes. Tari Eason is at the top of my list out of this group of guys. I think he has the potential to be top 100 this year. If you're not familiar with him, he's a rookie for the Houston Rockets going into this season. In the first 3 preseason games, he's had 21 and 10, 24 and 8, and then 17 and 12 with a steal and a block in all of those games. So he's just looking like an absolute sleeper of an option for if you want to take a late round flyer on a rookie. The only problem the only cause for concern is that he does have to play behind, maybe Eric Gordon or a Jayshawn Tate. They might start over him because the Rockets are complete dumbasses when it comes to coaching, and they just play their veteran guys for absolutely no reason. But anyways, kind of going off on a tangent on the Rockets there. But I do think Tari Eason is good enough to sort of overshoot them, and I think once Steven Silas sort of recognizes what he has on his hands here, we are going to see Tari Eason with the starting lineup, and I think he's going to put up very solid fantasy numbers this year. So I think it's definitely worth taking a sleeper pick on him. I mean, for your last round, I think he definitely has top 100 value. If you can get him anywhere after that, I think it's a good pick, especially if you're getting him in the 140 range, which he's not getting drafted in a lot of leagues, so I definitely think he has a lot of upside. Then moving up next, we have Santi Aldama from the Memphis Grizzlies. Again, this is another player that might not be too well known to you if you're not too familiar with fantasy, or if you're new to watching the NBA or fantasy or stuff like that. He's only rostered in 1% of leagues right now, but he is the starting power forward for the Grizzlies. If we're looking at him in preseason, I mean, he's been doing his thing. He's a very solid 3-point shooter. Doesn't give you too much in the peripheral stats, but I mean, he can put up some scoring numbers here and there. He's getting starting minutes, and he's going to be a decent rebounder as he plays the power forward spot. grabs around eight rebounds per game in the preseason. Obviously, you can't read too much into preseason games, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him average at least like 5 or 6 rebounds a game. Put that alongside, maybe 12 points. I mean, for an end of draft pick, what more can you ask for, especially when you get to like pick 140, stuff like that? You're just kind of looking for any source of value that you can grab, and I definitely think Santi Aldama fits that category. So definitely think it's worth taking a sleeper on him. There is the concern that once Jaren Jackson Jr. gets back into the lineup, we could see his production fall off. But even if you just draft Santi until Jaren Jackson Jr. comes back into the lineup, and then you can sort of make a waiver wire pickup and change him out if his value drastically falls off a cliff, it's not a bad option to be getting solid fantasy value for a month out of one guy when you're picking him with like your last pick in a draft. So moving on, next up we got Rui Hachimura, Washington Wizards. Didn't play a lot last year, but he is going to be in their starting lineup this season. I think he is a very solid player. Could very easily overshoot his average draft position right now, which is at 140 like the rest of these guys. They have him projected to score around 13 points per game with 5 rebounds. I wouldn't be surprised to see that scoring average be a little bit higher. I think he is definitely a better player than ESPN's giving him credit for. If we're looking at when he did return to the Wizards at the end of last season, he sort of started to find his groove. He had about 5 20-point games to close the season out. So if we're looking at stuff like that, it does give me hope that we could see his scoring numbers take a bit of a jump this year. And if you're just looking for straight potential for a late-round sleeper, I think Hachimura is your guy. Like I said, I would draft Eason and Aldama before him, although maybe if you want, whole season value, you could draft Hachimura over Aldama. I wouldn't be too mad about that. I definitely think Eason is the best out of this group, though. But yeah, moving on. Next up, we got another rookie, this time from the OKC Thunder. You may not be too familiar with him, but his name is Jalen Williams, and he looks like an absolute stud. I was watching him in the summer league. I've been watching him in preseason. I mean, on the OKC Thunder, we all know there's tons of minutes to go around. We don't know who's going to be playing out of them for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Josh Giddey and the Lou Dort factors. If they miss some time, I think Jalen Williams could see some very solid fantasy productions, and even if they're all healthy in play, I still think we could see Jalen Williams put up some very respectable fantasy numbers, especially for a last-round pick. So yeah, he can kind of do it all. I mean, he looks like a very solid scorer, grabbed a decent amount of rebounds so far in preseason. Last game he had 16 points, 7 rebounds, 3 assists, and 3 steals. He has very active hands on the defensive end. I don't know if too many of you have been watching the Thunder's preseason, which, I can't really blame you, but when I'm looking for sleepers, I'm just watching every team to just kind of see how everybody's looking. So yeah, definitely looking like a solid option for a late round pick. I think he is worth a flyer if you want to take a flyer on a rookie. I think Jalen Williams is your guy to go for after Tari Eason. And then, yeah, next up, Jared Vanderbilt. He's on the Utah Jazz now. Otherwise, I don't think he would have very relevant fantasy value because it's just the lack of scoring, man. It's nice when you have guys that can give you good, peripheral stats like Vanderbilt can. But just when you're missing, averaging less than 10 points per game, it's just so hard to be a reliable fantasy contributor. But on ESPN, I mean, they don't even have him, projected for anything right now, which is just absolutely insane to me. He's just, it's as if he doesn't exist. His average draft position is around 140. No projections for him whatsoever, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him average around 8 rebounds, maybe 2 steals per game, and then average that out with however many points he might seem to grab. And if he's in the starting lineup, maybe he can give you 8 points, 8 rebounds with 2 steals. Wouldn't be too surprised to see that happen. He's a very active player on the defensive end, and getting starting minutes, I don't know. I just think it's a recipe to give you some solid fantasy nights. Definitely could have nights where, he gets a ton of lobs from Clarkson, Conley, and who else is in that backcourt? Colin Sexton. And then, I don't know. I could see it translating to some decent fantasy value for Jared Vanderbilt. Obviously, I don't think he's going to be close to the top 100 or anything like the rest of these guys have the potential to do that are above him. But I still think he's a solid option to pick up for a last pick, especially if you get past the 150 range and you're just looking for value. Jared Vanderbilt could be your man. So next up, and last sleeper on my list is another rookie, this time Mark Williams for the Charlotte Hornets. I mean, he does seem to be their best option at center, in my opinion. The only problem is that, the Charlotte Hornets have Steve Clifford coaching, and, he loves to play his guys. They still have Plumlee projected to start, which I seriously don't understand, and I never will. I feel like Plumlee and DeAndre Jordan just have, and Robin Lopez just have some kind of, dirty secret on the league that forces teams to keep, playing them, because they're pretty much unplayable, especially for starters minutes that Plumlee is projected to be getting, which is just absolutely ridiculous to me when you have young centers on the bench. Anyway, I'm just going on a tangent at the end. Mark Williams, if he can get past Plumlee and get into the starting lineup, which I think he definitely has the potential to do, and it's not like it's a crazy difficult task to outplay Mason Plumlee. I'm just turning into a shit on Plumlee video, but yeah, I do think Mark Williams can work his way into the starting lineup, and if he's getting around 30 minutes per game playing alongside LaMelo and Terry Rozier, could definitely see him way overshooting his average draft or his draft projections for how many points per game, etc. they think he's going to be scoring, and definitely could be a worthwhile sleeper pick to get at the end of a draft, or maybe get late in like the 150 ranges if you're in like a 16 to 20 team league and you just want to pick someone up. So, with that being said, that is going to conclude my sleeper video for this year. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope it helps you guys out with your drafts. Like I said, if you have any sleepers you think I missed, any sleeper picks I've made that you disagree with, just drop a comment and let me know. You don't have to be an ass about it. It's not a big deal, just trying to help you guys out with your drafts. We're all just trying to help each other, so that's going to do it for me. I appreciate you guys so much for watching, and as always, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.